So pleasure to have Gwen telling us about why do we model infectious diseases.
Yeah. Okay, so hello everybody. As many of you know, I'm Gwen Knight and I'm a lecturer at Imperial College London. And what we tried to do with the three of us here, so Seb, Anton and myself, was that we tried to think of a way that we could teach you sort of like a subset trajectory within this workshop this week about ways to model infectious diseases, but thinking much more about modeling infectious diseases at the population level, so thinking about the spread of TB or Ebola. So I know you've heard quite a lot about the biology of the immune system and thinking about the sort of workings of the pathogen in infection. And you've heard a lot about the mathematics of how you build a compartmental model, such as an SIR model, and how you extend it with births and deaths. And yesterday you heard from Anton about how to extend those kind of models into stochastic models. So you've heard a lot about the biology, you've heard a lot about the maths. You're going to do some practicals where you're going to get some hands-on experience with the modeling. But what I thought I would do in this lecture today, so sort of halfway through this trajectory of population-level infectious disease modeling, is kind of step back a little bit and think about why are we doing this modeling, what the interactions with policymakers and those interested in the outputs of our modeling, what those kind of outputs are, and also some of the practicalities of modeling. So say you want to become a modeler of the spread of TB, how do you actually decide what you put into your TB model, what questions you ask of your TB model, who do you interact with, and what your inputs and outputs would be of your model scenario. So the aims of this lecture are to try to introduce you to some of the main concepts of modeling for public health, so trying to sort of step back and think about policymakers and sort of the people that are going to be using the outputs of our infectious disease modeling. Then talk through some of the practicalities of how you actually formulate a model. So it's all very well to hear about an SIR concept and the deterministic equations that you get from that, or the stochastic equations, but maybe those aren't quite right for our situation, and how do we know that we have the right set of ODEs for the right scenario or the right question? And also I want to sort of raise the idea that quite often these models we want to think about not only modeling, say, the natural history or the spread of a disease, but we also want to think about how to control a disease. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the complexities of how to introduce an intervention into a modeling framework. So, for example, a control mechanism, like the media, as we just heard. And as we've already heard a little bit the last few days, a lot of the work that I've done in infectious disease modeling is focusing on tuberculosis. So a lot of my examples that I'm going to motivate this lecture with are going to use the example of the spread of TB. So the title of my talk, I tried to think about, so why do we model infectious diseases? And I thought I would, first of all, just ask you guys. So we've asked you a lot about what experience you have and whether you're a mathematician or a biologist. But I wonder whether you can just stick your hand up and tell me why you're actually here. So why do you actually want to learn about modeling infectious diseases? Gautam, why are you here? Why did you organize this course? To predict? Yeah? You want to predict the future? Yeah, okay, that's a good one. Sorry? You want to understand more about the disease, yeah? Oh, to control the disease, sorry. Okay, so to control the disease. So you want to build a mathematical model so that you can predict the future and work out how to control it. Is that why everybody's here? Because you want to predict the future? To know the prevalence. Okay, so to understand more about what happened in the past and what the natural history of it and the prevalence of it is. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting in modeling for public policy. Okay, great. Okay, so that's kind of good, because I think all of those reasons are the reasons why I do modeling for infectious diseases. And we've heard a lot about immunology, and obviously there's a lot of modeling that you can do of the very pure biological concepts, and sometimes those don't necessarily link immediately to policy or to new drugs or to new vaccines. So I really want to emphasize that the modeling I'm talking about is very much the population modeling, the spread of diseases through a population, and things like how we can predict the interventions control. So I would say that one of the main reasons that I do it is because it's interesting. So obviously, as we've heard over the last few days, there's some interesting mathematics, there's some interesting biological and dynamical questions, and there's also some interesting sort of political and socio-economic. Infectious diseases affect us all, and that can be one of the main reasons why maybe we're interested in modelling it. And then these two have come up. That's really great. So the idea that maybe we want to understand the natural history or the epidemiology of an infectious disease. So for example, we want to understand why we have an outbreak scenario sometimes, and in other situations why we have an endemic disease. And we also want to look at the relative impact of interventions. So how do we control it? What would happen if we changed our current behavior? How would the levels of disease change? And then, as someone said down here, maybe we want to predict the future. And obviously that's relatively complex task. So from going from that, so we think that we want to model infectious diseases, and we think that it's interesting, and we want to control, we want to try and control TB, for example. But how do we actually know what we want to model? So how do we go from that big question of modeling infectious diseases and the generality of an SIR model to actually knowing what to model? So I would argue that one of the first things, or one reason one way we can work out what we want to model is to think about the mathematics. So if we're going to build a model, we have to be able to write it down mathematically. So we have to choose a question that is appropriate to use a model for. But also maybe we know something about the interesting dynamics in the situation, and we might know that we want to model this because we think the dynamics will be interesting. However, I would argue that one of the more interesting and I would argue better ways of deciding what to model is by interacting with policymakers and those people that are making the decisions about how we control infectious diseases, and that we should decide, or I think one of the main reasons or the main ways that we should decide what to model is by talking to those people that are actually going to use the output of our models. So for example, there's not really any point in building a mathematical model to look at the impact of an intervention that a policymaker would never implement, for example. So I think one of the most interesting things about being a mathematical modeler of infectious diseases is that you get to actually interact with policymakers and think about the ways that you can build a model that can actually have an impact either on the local level or the country level or even at the global level. Now, the other interesting thing about being an infectious disease modeler, I think, is this idea of the campfire effect of mathematical models. So this is something that my former supervisor at the London School is very keen on, and he introduced me to this idea. But many of us in the room here today are mathematicians or physicists, and so we're completely used to this idea that we can break down complex scenarios into simple logical statements. So, for example, simple equations, or maybe not so simple equations, but equations where every single stage in the process is written down in terms of mathematical symbols and simple interactions. Whereas if you're a policymaker, or you're a historian, or you're a clinician, or you're somebody who's working on the front line trying to control an outbreak, then potentially you're not thinking about those logical steps that lead to the spread of an infectious disease. Instead, you're trying to panic because you don't know what's the best intervention to control. And often these people will have an idea or a model in their head, but they've never written it down on paper because they've never had to. They're just giving out the treatment, or they're trying to decide whether they should wash everybody's hands or screen everybody when they arrive at the hospital. And so by building a mathematical model of an infectious disease, what you actually do is you pin down various ideas into a logical system of rules and behaviors. For example, one of the key things that often gets criticized about mathematical models is this mass action assumption. So we heard this at the end of the talk. And this idea that the fact that we often include in models the idea that one infectious person can infect any other individual in the room. And this is obviously a big criticism, or potentially sometimes a big criticism of mathematical models. But actually, when you write that criticism down on paper and you present that to a policymaker and say, I want to model the spread of TB, and what I'm assuming is that everybody in this population can infect everybody else, and the policymaker says, wow, that's crazy, that's completely ridiculous, why on earth are you assuming that? And then you say, okay, well, what would you do instead? So would you have me say that transmission in households is twice as big as in the community, or would you have me say that transmission in households is 5 times as likely as transmission in a church, as transmission, say, in a motor vehicle where you've got 10 people sharing a space with no air conditioning. And so once you start writing that assumption down, although it can be criticized and shot at, then you're making people think about what the alternative is. And once you get people thinking about what the alternative is, then you get people thinking about what the next study is that they should do, what the next piece of data they should collect is, and also about whether actually for TB, the ability to transmit to everyone in a population isn't actually such a bad approximation, and for now we should use that as an approximation. But I hope I'm giving you an idea there that one of the powerful things about infectious disease modeling is that by breaking things down to a logical set of equations and a set of dynamics, that's actually something that can be very useful to policymakers and other people external to the field. So when you interact with policymakers, one of the key things they usually ask for is for the impact of interventions. So often they're less interested in what happened in the past, and they're interested in maybe understanding why the prevalence is so high. But what they're more interested in is how we can do better in the future, and what different interventions you can control, or what interventions would be best for control. So obviously, often this is needed for, well, I put here several different reasons why you might model different interventions. But obviously, using a model, we can do things like produce the input for cost-effectiveness models. We can use our understanding of the natural history, potentially from modeling what's happened in the past, to go forward and understand what the most influential impact of an intervention would be. And we can use this to compare different interventions over time. So the key thing for this, if you want to become an infectious disease modeler that includes interventions, is that you need to think, when you're designing your model, about what the hook in the model is going to be. So what I mean by this is that if you're going to have an intervention that's, for example, going to look at increasing use of the media, then you need to include in your model the impact of the media on the transmission. So, or for example, if you want to look at improved treatment success, then you need to think about how in your model you're going to include the rate of treatment and how that rate is going to change if you improve treatment success. And all of these things can help support policy decisions. They can alter where research funding ends up. They can alter trial design and also product pipelines. And I would argue that modeling is very good for assessing interventions because models are flexible, so you can consider not only a single intervention but a combination. You can capture the mechanics of the intervention, so you can say, well, the intervention consists of several components, but actually this part of the intervention is the most important one. And comparatively, compared to big clinical trials of new vaccines or any big clinical trials, and often compared to lab work, modelers are relatively cheap, and we work relatively fast compared on this time scale of clinical trials. So I'm hoping that in the future that more and more infectious disease modelers will actually be involved in the decision-making process. But obviously you have to be very aware. So mathematical models are often very appealing to policymakers because they're this shiny black tool, like black box tool, that will give them a value which they can then go forward and run with. But obviously, like any scientific tool, you have to be very careful in your model designs. You can't make it too simple. You also can't make it too complicated. You have to use the best available data, the best disease understanding, and the best understanding of the intervention process. And one of the key things for policymakers is that although they will often push you to give them the single golden value, so if I include this intervention in my model, how much will it decrease TB incidence in the future? Often they will want you to just give them a single value, like, oh, it'll do a 10% decrease or something. And you have to be very careful that as a modeler you convey the amount of uncertainty that's included in our models. For example, uncertainty due to natural history parameters, uncertainty due to coverage of the intervention, and even uncertainty due to things like the impact of the intervention. So there's all very important things to include. And also to acknowledge that our uncertainty about the impact of intervention will increase rapidly when you predict into the future. So obviously we know less well what the impact of an intervention will be next year than we do what the impact of that intervention would be 10 years, because we don't know how, for example, TB incidence is going to change over that period. So designing a good intervention model requires a lot of thought, and it requires a lot of understanding on your part, but also a good explanation to the policymakers of what you're trying to do. So in this middle section, what I thought I would do is just describe some of the modelling that I know of that has had an impact on policy, just so that you have some examples of where models have had an impact. Then what I'm going to do in the main part of the talk is go through the sort of the practical steps to building a model. So as we said, we've heard about the basics of an SIR model, but I want to sort of show you an overview of how you would go about building your model. And then I'll end on sort of some concrete examples of model building for policy. So it's actually quite interesting when you try to think about a model that's had a direct impact on policy, because quite often policy is only changed when there's a huge body of evidence that comes together to sway policymakers. So quite often modeling is one component in that. For example, like a clinical trial would just be one component in changing policy. So one of the earliest ones in TB was a paper done by Chris Dye in 1998, which looked at the impact of DOTS, which is directly observed short treatment for TB. And what he did was he compared what would happen if you had an increased case detection rate. So he looked at, in his model, increasing the case detection rate for TB against the background level of an already 4% decline in incidence rate, or a currently steady incidence rate. So you can see when the incidence rate is steady or isn't falling at all, then you're going to have a much bigger impact as you scale up your case detection rate than if it's already falling, so you have a less of an impact. I would argue that I've had some impact, or small impact, on the TB vaccine world, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that intervention later on. I would argue that Seb and Anton have had recently quite a large impact on policy making within the Ebola outbreak, and a lot of that was due to their rapid generation of situation reports by the two of them and other members of the modelling centre at the London School. So if you want to have a look at what they did, that's all on the CMMID website. And also, one of the main examples, or one of the most interesting examples that I'll talk about it in detail now, is the impact on HIV control of a model by Granich et al. In 2009. And one of the key quotes, again, that my former supervisor found was this quote from Hillary Clinton when she was US Secretary of State in 2011. And she actually quoted in a speech about mathematical modeling. So we can all hope that she makes it to be the first female president of the US in a couple of years' time, and that she continues to support the use of mathematical modeling to change policy in the US. Okay, so focusing on the HIV control, this was a really interesting paper that came out in the Lancet. And what they did was they built this model of HIV. So what you have is susceptible individuals being born, they get infected, and then they progress through decreasing CD4 counts until they end up with a very low CD4 count, and then they die. And then there's some rate at which they get started on antiretroviral therapy. So if they're on antiretroviral therapy, they're in a state A, 1 to 4. And in this state, they have a lower infectious. So they're less infectious. And they're less infectious by this factor epsilon. So here, J are those individuals that are infectious, and I is everybody that's infected. So using this relatively simple model, what they did was try to predict the impact of different interventions to control HIV using data from South Africa. So what you can see here is sort of the classic public health intervention model output, in that you have the past epidemic, and they actually fitted to prevalence, but I'm showing you the results for incidence. So they did fit to the prevalence curve, which for South Africa sort of goes up and then was flatlining here in 2000. And so what you have here is, with the no intervention scenario in the red line, this is what they predicted would happen if they just carried on doing what they were currently doing, which at the time was providing antiretroviral therapy to anybody when their CD4 count dropped below 200. So for those of you that don't know about HIV epidemiology, or the natural history of HIV, it affects your CD4 T cell count. This is a sort of immunological marker. Most humans, depending on the country and the setting, have a CD4 count that's above 800 up to 1,000 possibly, or even higher. now the current ART guidelines in South Africa have actually improved, so they've gone from giving ART at less than 200 to less than 500. But basically this is a marker, as this decreases, this is a marker of how far your HIV is progressing. So the blue line is sort of like, let's do a little bit better at giving ART, so let's give ART to people when they're a little bit more healthy and see if that has an impact on HIV incidence. And then what the main focus of their paper was this idea that actually what happens if we found everybody that had HIV in South Africa and we gave everybody antiretroviral therapy immediately. So this is obviously an extremely ambitious public health intervention. Screening everybody in South Africa for HIV is already sort of a very expensive and a very ambitious public health intervention. But what you can see is that they found that it would have a dramatic impact on the HIV incidence, and a dramatic impact relatively rapidly, which is the important thing. So from this model, they concluded that universal HIV testing and immediate starting of antiretroviral therapy would have a big impact on HIV incidence, and therefore they recommended that this is something that should be uptaken by South Africa and by other countries around the world. And so what's interesting to do is sort of go back and look at their model and see whether you actually believe their results. And there are a couple of things in here that immediately strike you as odd. So first of all, looking at this for anybody who knows anything about HIV or has tried to model HIV, obviously huge complexities of social contact behavior, and modeling it as some kind of mass action assumption immediately shouts out a little bit odd. The other thing is this idea that everybody that was on antiretroviral therapy has a single constant reduced infectivity. And it's likely that those individuals with a lower CD4 count have a higher viral load and therefore are more infectious. So you might expect this epsilon value to depend on your CD4 count. The other interesting thing was that they assumed something, and I'm not an expert on HIV transmission, so this might be quite common, that heterogeneity, to allow for heterogeneity in sexual behavior, they allowed transmission to depend on prevalence. So I'm not quite sure whether that's done often, but that doesn't strike me as particularly accurate for HIV. And they also assumed that all HIV transmission was heterosexual. And again, I'm not sure if this was for the politics of the audience who was reading this, or whether this was politics in South Africa. But again, these are very interesting assumptions that you could challenge if you were thinking about how to build models of HIV. But the output of this was ultimately huge. And so from this, basically nobody was thinking so ambitiously, or if they were, they didn't have any evidence to support that this would be a good thing to do. So using this model, there's actually been a big trial started, headed up by people at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is called the POP-ART study. And this is a study in South Africa and Zambia, where they now are actually trying to screen whole populations for HIV, so getting individuals to use self-testing, and then if they're HIV positive, they're giving them antiretroviral therapy. And this is one of the few scenarios where a modeling paper really changed people's opinions about the impact that an intervention could have, and result in a direct funding going immediately to this huge clinical trial. And hopefully the results of this, it would take several years for the results to come out, but hopefully the results are positive, and this will change antiretroviral therapy policy globally. Okay, so the main part of the lecture for the next sort of 20 minutes, I just want to talk about some of the practical steps to model building. So you probably all have your infectious disease of preference, and now you want to think about how I'm going to build a model and how I'm going to have some impact on policymakers. Or maybe you already have your question. But what I wanted to do is just go through this diagram here and talk about the practical steps that I myself and several other modelers that I know go through. And this is based on a textbook on modeling infectious diseases that's produced by colleagues at the London School. Okay, so like any scientific endeavor, the first step in modeling infectious disease would be to think about what is your question. So pinning down something that is testable, something that is relevant, and something that is potentially going to have interesting outputs. So I would argue that the first step is to think about and try to write down succinctly what your question is that you want to answer with your model, to ask yourself, is anybody else apart from me going to care about whether it's got 3 equilibriums or 5? Is it appropriate to use a model to answer this question? So that's something that's very important if you're dealing with policymakers. They can often ask you to explore things that actually they're not relevant to modeling. They're probably more relevant to statistical analysis. So that's something that's worth thinking about. And also, I would highlight that identifying the question, is it relevant? So not only is it useful, but is it relevant? So has someone already done it, or is anybody actually going to think about this intervention? Or is this intervention already old hat? Should I be thinking about what the next intervention is, including that in my model? And obviously at this stage, this is where it would be good to talk to different people in public health or different people in the area that you want to have impact in to check that your question is useful to them. So then the second step, so this is one that I think is slightly unusual in terms of putting it so high up in this process, but I would argue that if you had an infectious disease model and you don't have any information about the parameters, or you don't have any information about the incidence or prevalence of the disease, or you don't have any information, for example, relating to age-specific incidence, then you can't answer a question about what the past prevalence was or what the impact of your intervention will be if you don't have the data to know what's happening at the moment. So obviously, the main sources for the data are the scientific literature, but also WHO, CDC, country-level contacts, and expert opinion. There are many places that you can get this data from, and I refer a lot to the global TB reports that come out every year, which have a lot of information about the spread of TB. So then the third stage is choosing your modeling methods. So we haven't talked about many of these things in the course, but you have some quite clear black and white decisions to make. So do you make your model dynamic or static? So do you think about allowing the level of transmission to increase as the number of infectious people in your model increases? Or do you include a static, so you think that your force of infection is relatively constant over time? Your population is relatively small within the bigger population, for example. Do you build a compartmental or individual model? So the SIR, the classic compartmental model, but it's often quite tempting to go very complex and to start thinking about individual level models. For example, if you want to have an intervention that's targeted at the household level, maybe you want to build your model where you think about individual households rather than the whole compartmental model of a population. Yesterday you had an introduction to stochastic models, so do you need to think about including stochastic and random effects within your model, or is your population large enough, for example, that you can just use a deterministic model? And you need to think about transmission versus a cohort model. So what I mean by this is if you think about, for example, cost effectiveness analysis, quite often what they do there is they think about 1,000 people and they think there's some constant force of infection, and they look at that 1,000 people as they move through some kind of infection pathway. So that's one way of building an infectious disease model. The other way of doing it is to think about the whole population and to see there's some force of infection or some transmission going on, and to model that transmission dynamically. So the fourth and the first part are kind of related. So I would say from my own experience that most infectious disease models are dynamic, compartmental, deterministic, and they're transmission models, so they include the transmission factor in there. Again, I would say that's coming from my perspective as a TB modeler, but stochastic models, as Anton mentioned yesterday, are becoming more and more popular, but obviously they have huge complexities in terms of what stochasticity you include, how do you analyze your results, and also how do you present your results. Okay, so you've thought of your question, you've thought of the data that you're going to use, you've thought of the kind of model that you're going to build. So now you have to think about model structure. So this is where it comes down to what your individual disease is. And a quote that's often attributed to Einstein, but has also been attributed to many different people on the web, is that your model structure should be as simple as possible and no simpler. So quite often for infectious disease models, we have quite a lot of literature to base our model structure on. So for example, in the TB world, there's a huge range of papers out there looking at modeling TB. However, some diseases or for some scenarios, there is less literature, and you have to start thinking about going from the basics from the natural history forward. So this is kind of something that, again, Seb and Anton have been doing a lot with Ebola, relatively few modeling papers on this, so they had to start from scratch thinking about the natural history, how do you build that into a compartmental model, and what are the key natural history parameters that you need to include. As I mentioned with the Greenwich paper, the modeling structure for HIV can get very complicated very quickly if you start modeling different social contexts and social patterns within the transmission of HIV. But obviously you have to think about what your question is and whether you need to include all of those mixing pattern heterogeneities. And then thirdly, so the one that I'm just going to focus on for a little bit here is what kind of model structure do you use for TB? And as has already been mentioned here, this has a complex natural history and a complex transmission process. So here is another variant on the sort of natural history of TB figure. So you have an individual who's exposed to TB, and when they get exposed, there's potential that they can have no infection, or they can go on to become infected, have various stages of their infection, and then progress relatively rapidly to primary tuberculosis. So on this side, we have the disease states, and in the middle, we have infection. So once they become infected, they can either progress rapidly, or they can progress to latent infections. This is asymptomatic infection. And then potentially over a period of years, they can progress to post-primary TB. So they've not been reinfected, it's just their latent disease reactivating. Or there's a potential that over their lifetime, even though they've been infected, they never ever actually end up getting TB disease. However, you've also got the chance that someone who has been exposed and not been infected can get re-exposed, or that someone who's latently infected can get re-exposed. You get re-establishment, and then you get cycling back into disease progression. So many different factors in TB that's mainly complicated by this long time period. So this fact that you can be infected for many years and never progress to active TB, or you can be infected and progress very rapidly to active disease. So someone on Monday asked how you would go from an SIR model to a TB model. So I included this in here to try and show you some of the complexity and the differences, the different decisions that people make about model structure for TB. So here we have the simple SIR model with the infection rate and the recovery rate. So one of the first things that's different about TB is that those people that have been previously previously had active TB disease, then they can recover either via treatment or through natural cure, and then they can reactivate, so they can progress without any secondary infection. They can return to becoming in an active disease state. This can also happen through reinfection. So here we have the same lambda term, but now we're multiplying it by this trifactor. And this is the protection from infection to active disease by state X. So you'll see this term coming up again, but the idea is that it's thought that once you've been infected once by TB, you have some level of immunity, and that decreases your probability of becoming reinfected. Then the other key thing about TB disease is this idea of the latent state, so where you're infected, but actually you're not infectious. And this latent state can last for a very long time in TB. So it's probably more appropriate to think of an SEIR model rather than an SIR model. So for that, we need to have our infection rate. And we need to think about the fact that not everybody, when they become infected, progresses to the latent state, but actually a certain proportion skip the latent state and move immediately to become active infectious disease. So this is one of the simplest ways of including the fact that you can become infected and immediately progress to active disease or progress to latent disease. Or the other way to do it is to include two exposed states in here, so one which is called exposed slow and one which is called exposed fast. So you sit around in the exposed fast compartment for several weeks or several months before progressing to active disease. So then those people in the latent state, they have some very low level, very slow or small chance that they'll progress to active disease over their lifetime. or there's a chance that they can become reinfected, very much like these recovered individuals, and progress to active disease. So a parameter that's often hotly debated in the TB world is what the value of this, what the level of this parameter should be, and whether it should be different for people that have been previously had active disease or people who have never had previous active disease. One of the more simple ways to model TB is to actually combine these two states, so the recovery state and the latent state, and just think about individuals that used to have or did have active TB as returning to this latent state, and then they're exactly the same people as people who've never had active disease. So I should say that one of the things that myself and a colleague are really interested in looking at is the fact that this SIR model is very nice for diseases that have a sort of discrete infection and disease state. So for example, something like flu, you become infected, you get disease, and you progress, and you've got some kind of immunity. Whereas for TB, there's increasing evidence coming that people actually fluctuate between these two states in almost like a continuous fashion. So they've got some bacterial burden, that burden increases over time, they get active TB, maybe they don't get treatment and they cure it and it drops again. And then sometime later it comes up again, causes active disease, possibly causes transmission, and then drops down again. And eventually they reach a state where their body can no longer control that bacterial burden. They're moving significantly into being an active infectious disease, and that's when they're detected and they get treatment. So that's something that we're trying to think about, trying to challenge this sort of basic model structure for TB and try to think about actually making these some kind of continuous fluctuation between these two. But yeah, we haven't done it yet. So the important thing to mention is that, as Anton mentioned a little bit yesterday, it's only these people here that we see. So we only see those people that have active TB disease, that turn up in clinics, that are symptomatic, and that ask or are coming for treatment. Whereas actually there's a substantial portion of the population that are infected TB, and these are often found through prevalence surveys, so you can do skin tests to find out if someone has potentially been either infected with TB in the past or still infected. But actually we have very little idea of the bacterial burden in these states. So we don't really know if these people are still carrying active TB that could become infectious, or whether they've controlled it, and this is just an immune marker saying that they used to have TB and they no longer do. So the only thing that we really know is something about those people that turn up in clinics with active TB disease. Okay, so I wanted to just show you, so this is sort of expanding out the SIR model and me trying to think about the simple ways that you can go from an SIR model to a TB model. But actually there are many different TB model structures, which makes it an interesting but complex disease to work on. So one of the first ones, as I mentioned, was this difference between disease and infection. So the simplest way that you could build a TB model is simply to think of some people get latently infected and some people get infectious. Highly simple, but captures one of the key problems with TB disease, is sort of latency versus infectiousness. Or you could build a much more complicated model like this. You could think about people being susceptible, being infected. When they've been infected, they're fast progressors, and they move either to infectious disease, active disease, or infectious but less infectious disease. So here smear status is a marker of infectivity. And then you have these other complexities. So these are different latent. So basically you've got 3 boxes where this model has 1 for your latent disease status. The other thing that divides TB modelers is how you deal with risk of disease by time since infection. So I'm a TB modeler that thinks that because TB disease lasts for such a long time, we often think in our TB models on a level of years rather than weeks, which you might think of for other diseases such as flu. And so I usually build a model a bit like the SIR model that I showed you, where a proportion of initial infections progress immediately to active disease and a different proportion progress slowly to latent infection. But some people pull it apart and think about a slow latent and a fast latent box and allow people to sit there and have different control measures which can affect that. I mentioned reinfection in the SIR model. So that becomes more important and more complicated when you think about the spread of different strains of TB, which I have to say is not done very often. But for example, here you have a model where you have the spread of a drug-susceptible TB and the spread of a drug-resistant TB. And then you have this whole complexity here with these dashed arrows of reinfection. So someone who is latently infected with a susceptible strain can become reinfected with a resistant strain, or they become infected with a resistant strain and move rapidly to active TB, or just stick in latent TB. Those people that are latently infected with drug susceptible can be reinfected with a susceptible strain and progress immediately to active TB. So you have all this complexity in here. And what I'm not showing you here is an even more complicated model where you have mixed infections. So for example, you could imagine a compartment in the middle here where you have both susceptible and drug-resistant strains. And then you have even more complexity in terms of protection from reinfection. And when you get reinfected, which strain do you reactivate? Do you reactivate the susceptible or the resistant TB strain? So the other thing, especially when we're thinking about interventions, is how do you include detection and treatment? So I've actually split up this model by Chris Dye here. So this is the bottom of this model here. And yeah, it's not very good. But what you can see here is that you have treatment failures, and these guys often are the ones that have drug-resistant TB. You have treatment failure 1, 2, and 3, and depending on the outcome of these different treatment failures, you can either be cured or you can die. And so different TB models think about this differently. You can either include a simple cure rate, which moves you to recovered, or you can try and pull apart detection and treatment in many different ways. And the final complication, as I mentioned, is whether you think about recovered individuals as being different to latently. So here you can see this model is like an SEI model. It doesn't include the recovered path because we think that individuals that cure active TB return to this latent box. Okay, so I've tried to pull apart there some of the main complexities and definitely debated areas in TB modeling. So here's an example or a slide just showing you some of the other TB models that have been used. Again, this one here, so Chris Dye is a very well-known TB modeler that works for the WHO, and he's done a lot, or he did a lot of the old TB models. Yeah, so he's a big fan of the recovered box. Some other people have tried to pull apart the active disease component and think about some people with TB get pulmonary TB, and it's either smear positive or smear negative. But some people also get non-pulmonary TB, and trying to think about whether that's important, whether detection of those individuals is important. So quite often I would generally ignore these individuals within my models because I'm interested in the transmission and the spread of TB, and only those individuals that have pulmonary smear-positive TB are actually of interest in terms of causing secondary cases. But obviously that's because I'm interested in decreasing the incidence of infectious individuals, those with the worst TB disease that turn up in clinics. But if you are interested in actually trying to capture these other guys, then you would need to include them in your model structure. Okay, so the complexity of choosing model structure, I've tried to show you how difficult it is for TB. Quite often you're relying on what the colleagues that you work with have built before, which TB models you believe the most, and which TB data you believe the most in terms of the natural history parameters, and also obviously the question is very important. So the other thing that should inform your model structure, so these two things are kind of extremely interlinked, is what your model input and outputs want to be. So quite often your inputs are relatively easy or depend very little on your question. So things like the effective contact rate. We had some discussion the other day about the fact that you wouldn't just have a background mortality rate, you've got a higher mortality rate when you've got active disease, and you might have a different detection and or treatment rate. But then your outputs, so your outputs are going to depend very strongly on what the relevant data that you've identified, what your relevant data are, and also what your question is. So you need to make sure that your model is going to give you an output that allows you to answer your question, and also that your model gives you output that can be linked back to the data. So for example, if you want to match to mortality data, then you need to make sure that you're building into your model appropriate and well-informed mortality rates. So linking back, as I said, linking back to what you've decided already, you have to think about what is your question, so make sure your outputs are directly linking back to your question. And you also have to think about the fact that you're quite often going to be working in a space where there is a lack of data. and this is where it becomes very important to have interaction with policymakers or local people on the ground that maybe can inform you not necessarily about where there is data, but what they think the parameters are, for example, for effective, or not for effective contact rate, but for detection and treatment rate. Okay, so up to now I've been talking about what you would do to build your model, and now once you've built your model, you've input your data, you've specified which natural history parameters you're going to use and which output you're going to create. The next thing to do is to set up and check the model. So I'd argue here that one of the key things to do is to try and think about what you expect your model to produce. So, for example, you would expect that if you increase the disease-specific death rate, then your mortality rate would increase. However, obviously, if you have a bug in your code, that won't happen. So this is the point at which you really need to push your model to the extreme. So you need to say, okay, I realize that mortality rate is never going to be 100%, but let me just check. If I put it to 100%, you might get a crazy high mortality rate. And so this is where you've really got to make sure that you believe the results of your model. You're not just trying to find the question here, you're sort of stopping and checking that your model code works, and that when you change your parameters, you get results that depend on those changes. So this is mainly a bug checking step. So then the next step, once you think your model does what you want it to do, you'll have several parameters that you won't know very much about. And often these are the ones related to transmission, such as the effective contact rate. And at this stage, you need to calibrate your model. So you need to use your model to make a prediction or to predict what the model says would be the TB incidence between 2000 and 2010. And then you need to calibrate it to the data. So I'm not going to talk about this very much. It's linked directly to the outputs that you have, the data availability in the question. But this is something that we're going to focus on in the lectures by Seb and the practical tomorrow, is how you go about calibrating the model and some of the methods that you can do to do this and to check that your model is reflecting reality. So the final step is to try and answer the question. So this is actually the interesting part. This is where you get your results. This is where you're going to interact with policymakers and say, this is what I think my model predicts. So you have to try and answer your question. You have to feed back to the interested parties. And also here's where the key part that should never be underestimated is to explore the sensitivity and uncertainty in your results. So for example, can you say that it's a 10% impact with a relatively high confidence, or is it a 10% impact that goes between 0 and 20% depending on your natural history parameters? So this is where you really have to think about where the uncertainty is in the model and which parameters are driving that uncertainty. Okay, so I've got like 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do now is just talk you through an example of a model that I constructed to answer a question in the TB world. Just go through that, the model construction practicalities flow diagram, and show you how I address those various stages. Okay, so the example is thinking about TB. So as I'm sure many of you know here, TB is a huge global problem, and we've recently achieved the glamorous status, or TB has achieved the glamorous status of being equal to HIV in terms of being the #1 infectious disease killer in the world. And it caused an estimated 1.5 million deaths in 2014. So it's a big problem here in India. It's estimated that 24% of all cases of TB in 2013 occurred here. So that sounds pretty terrifying and a very worrying statistic, but actually, interestingly, if you look at incidence in terms of absolute numbers, then India is way out there. But if you look at incidence in terms of rate per 100,000, then India drops off the top 10 countries. So it's one of those interesting things about how do you report the stats. And what's interesting about TB and the WHO is that often they focus on what's called the 22 high burden countries, of which India would definitely be a member. And that's on absolute numbers of TB cases. But I don't know, I think maybe I would argue that this is a bit of a more worrying number in terms of the incidence rate. So the question that, or the project that I'm going to talk about is one that relates to TB vaccines. So we had a little bit about BCG on Monday, but what I'm going to talk about here is the impact of new TB vaccines. So investment in TB vaccines is expanding. There's a lot of interest, especially from the Gates Foundation. I think Bill Gates wants to use the Microsoft money to eradicate some infectious disease from the world. It's probably more likely to be malaria at the rate that TB is going, but I think that's his aim. And so the question that we had, or the question that we were asked to model, was to think about who should new TB vaccines be given to. So I should state here that this is kind of a modeling question to think about the future and to think about where policymakers should be designing interventions. So we don't actually have a new TB vaccine. So traditionally, vaccines are obviously mainly given to infants, and that's because they're often the easiest population to get hold of. They're coming in for regular assessments in their first few months and years of life. But we know for TB that the biggest burden of disease is in adolescent and adults, so in the 16 to 25-year-old, this is where you have the highest number of cases. And so the question was, should we give new TB vaccines to infants, or should we give them to adolescent adults? And then ultimately it was linked to whether this would be cost effective, because it's likely that giving it to adolescent adults would cost a lot more money than giving it as part of the standard DCP3 vaccine program, which we use for infants. So I added this in after Monday's lecture to talk about BCG. So we didn't really consider the impact of BCG. It's known to have extremely variable efficacy. And my understanding of it, as Vanita said, she had kind of her hand-wavy immunological reason. But if you think about clinical trials of BCG, what they would do is they would look at individuals that had no BCG in India, for example, and those individuals that had BCG. And they found, or usually what they find in countries that have high levels of mycobacterium exposure in the environment anyway, that those people that had BCG had the same levels of TB disease incidence as those without. And my hand-wavy explanation for that would be that BCG is just like being exposed to another environmental mycobacterium. And those people in the control arm that never had BCG are being exposed to environmental bacterium anyway. So it's like both arms are being exposed multiple times to multiple, almost like vaccinations, but they're just with background mycobacterium. So what we did in this modeling work was that we assumed that the coverage would continue at the same level, and so we assumed that this was a part of the data and a part of the ongoing TB incidence, so we didn't model it explicitly. Okay, so going back to the flow diagram, so our question was relatively easy, so we knew that the first thing was, should we give new TB vaccines to infants or adolescents? The data that we had, as I mentioned, we used a lot of WHO level data for TB. For HIV, we used data from UN AIDS. The demographic data, so on how many people in each country or at each age, was UN data. And then we also had some, I think this was also UN, sorry I didn't write that up there, data on, or actually maybe this was Gavi, vaccine coverage by country. So for example, how many infants are currently vaccinated in the DCP3 strategy. And then we included 94 countries, so 97% of the TB burden in low and middle income countries was included in this analysis. So we identified the question, we identified the data. We decided that we needed to do a dynamic transmission model, but because we were dealing at the country level, we could make it deterministic. And we decided to go with the compartmental model. So it looked something like this. So compared to the other TB models that you've seen, it was slightly, slightly more simplified, sort of in the middle of all the complexity that I showed you. But we included in here the idea of having infectious and non-infectious individuals. And we included the recovered class here because this is where we put our vaccines. Oh, actually, no, that's not where we did it. But anyway, we included it in there. And so we separated out latent and recovered as separate. Now, this is where the question drives the model structure. So here we were interested in, should we give TB vaccines to infants or adolescents? So our TB model had to include age. It also had to include HIV status, a key co-infection risk factor for TB. And we also had to include vaccine status. So we had to allow for individuals in the model to be vaccinated or unvaccinated state. So our model inputs were the standard TB natural history parameters, HIV incidence, birth, death rate, vaccination coverage, and then our outputs, not only did we have to think about TB outputs, we also had to think about vaccine outputs. So in this example, what we had to do, we didn't have a TB vaccine, but we were trying to sort of influence what policymakers might want in a vaccine. And so we assumed that the vaccine would prevent all active disease. So it wouldn't prevent infection, but it would prevent progression to the active disease state. So this was kind of our intervention hook. We assumed that vaccines would stop this. So this is where we could hook in our intervention and stop progression. And to do this, we assumed that the vaccine would be introduced in 2024, which is when the policymakers informed us was their most ambitious early date for a new TB vaccine. And it would either be given continuously to infants or to 10-year-olds in a continuous fashion at school, and then in mass campaigns to everybody who's an older age group. Okay, so once we decided all that, we had our model structure, we specified our model inputs and outputs, and then we spent a lot of time at this stage here, so setting up and checking the models, making sure that we were, if we pushed vaccine coverage to the maximum, we would have a big impact. If we set vaccine coverage to 0, that would be exactly the same as if we had no vaccine in the model. Various things that we had to do. And then we calibrated our model to the data. So to do this, what we did was we searched parameter space. So we took a lot of different samples from parameter space and found those that most closely matched the data. And the results that we got look a little bit like this. So for low-income countries, what you can see here in red is the data for population size, TB disease incidence, and TB mortality. The model output is in black and the uncertainty in grey. You can see the model uncertainty gets bigger as we go forward. And also, we were told by policymakers that they were going to do very well at controlling TB disease before 2024. So they wanted us to assume that we had already decreased TB incidence a lot by rolling out things like better antiretroviral therapy for HIV and improving TB disease treatment. So we had to include that in our model. And then what we did was we looked at 2 different scenarios, so targeting the vaccine at infants. So here we have our 3 hypothetical different vaccines, or 9 hypothetical different vaccines. So they had different efficacies at reducing progression to active disease, and they had different durations of protection. And what we found was that in the baseline scenario, which is the black line here, actually if you gave a vaccine to infants, by 2050 you would have very little impact. So the vaccine that they think is most likely is one that gives 10-year protection and 40% efficacy, and you'd only avert around 2% of the TB case burden. Hey. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the vaccine prevents those that are lately infected getting active disease. So in infants, everybody is susceptible, but they can become infected very quickly. And if it lasts for 10 years, then it protects them up until they're 10 years old from becoming active disease. Yeah. So that's why, for example, the lifelong vaccine here, you can see that it's having an impact. So the infants that were vaccinated at age 0, they hit age 16 when the chances of getting TB disease increases a lot, and they're still protected from that progression. So that's why you see an impact. So the impact was very small in infants, but when we gave it to adolescent adults, again, this is a baseline scenario, and then these are the different efficacy colors and the different duration in the dashed lines. And this is the total number of cases, and then, again, if we looked at the same vaccine profile, you could avoid something more like 40%. And the weird wave behavior that you get here is due to the mass campaigns. So, for example, we assume that a vaccine duration of 5 years, you would give it, it would last for 5 years, and then protection would be released, and then you wouldn't do another campaign until, you would do a campaign every 10 years. So again, this is something that we're informed by the policymakers, that actually doing mass campaigns is relatively difficult. Imagine trying to vaccinate everyone in India every 10 years. It'd be a huge effort, and you would get much lower coverage every time that you did it. So they recommended that 10 years was the most frequent that it would ever realistically happen. Okay, so then the last part was to to do prediction, sensitivity analysis, and communication. So as I showed you, here we had relatively large, or huge, I would say, uncertainty criteria on this, specifically because we were predicting forward to 2050, and we really wanted to keep this uncertainty. This is something that the policymakers really pushed back on, like, how can you be so uncertain? And we were like, well, how can you be so certain about what happens in 2050? There's so much natural history uncertainty, and there's so much control uncertainty. Okay, so the impact that we had, so we linked it to cost effectiveness work. We had a paper out of it. We had a conference presentation. But the main interesting thing was that we did presentations back to the funder, who's an NGO funded by Gates. And this resulted in an increased evidence base for targeting TB vaccines at adolescent adults. So there's not solely because of this paper, but because a lot of work that's, or a sort of movement that's happening in the TB world. So there's now a lot of research into how to target this sort of difficult to reach population, linked again to things like the HPV vaccine and also the HIV vaccine, which are likely to be targeted at adolescent adults. But these are much harder to reach populations. But I have to say this was kind of the interesting part of the project, was to go back to funders and see what they thought about our results. And I would say that the interaction of policymakers is really important when you're building a model. So there's a really great model if you're interested in TB diagnostics, case detection and treatment. If you're really interested in that patient pathway, there's a paper by Lin et al. In the Bulletin of World Health for WHO. And they really tried to pull apart the standard natural history TB model and think about what happens to a patient. So they're sick, they go to a health center, they have sputum smear results. They really pulled apart this thing here. So their question was, if we really pull this apart, what would the impact be of a new diagnostic? So basically, how does the existing system, so how well we treat patients impact the impact of a diagnostic? And they use a deterministic transmission model with this expanded hook for the intervention. So basically, they wanted to know what would happen if they did better at diagnosing people. And they used data from Tanzania. And what they found was that actually in Tanzania, they're doing really well. And if you introduced a new diagnostic, it would have a very small impact. So it would decrease TB incidence by something very small, as less than 1%. What this paper did was it was a very, very broad modeling paper, and it was like, what if we introduced a new diagnostic, and it had this level of sensitivity and specificity. And they really didn't pin it down to anything, and they really didn't try and make strong conclusions about a particular single diagnostic. But everyone that reads this paper who works in the TB world knows that it was linked to this new shiny tool for TB, which is Gene Expert. So this is a molecular-based test for TB. It's kind of seen as like, this is going to cure TB, because basically it goes from, instead of being several days for a culture, or weeks even for a culture positive test, or several days for a smear positive test, this is in a matter of hours. So the idea was that a patient could come in, could give up a sputum sample and put it straight into the Gene Expert machine, and it would give you results as to whether or not you were TB positive, and also whether you were drug resistant within a few hours. And the South African health minister, he even can do the Gene Expert test. So this is saying, if even I can do it, then it's going to be really easy to roll it out, and we should do it. And so it has actually been rolled out across South Africa. So I just cut and paste a lot of words here. I'm sorry about that. But basically what they found in this recent trial was that mortality was not reduced by increasing experts. So they spent a lot of money introducing this shiny tool for TB across South Africa. It increased, basically what happened was that it increased confirmed TB diagnostics, or TB increased the number of TB diagnoses, but clinicians in South Africa were already diagnosing TB and treating it. So they didn't need this specific, rapid, fast TB diagnosis. They were seeing someone who had night sweats and a cough, and they were saying, it's TB, let's start them on treatment. So this because empirical therapy was already in place, and basically modeling could have informed this. So if this paper had been stronger in its conclusions, or had modeled using South Africa data, or had probably even done better at interacting with policymakers. So I'm not quite sure what they did in terms of interacting, but it's been very interesting to watch what's happened in South Africa and compare it to what the modelling would have predicted. And yeah, I would just say beware the policymaker and the shiny new tool. Okay, so I'm aware that I'm running over slightly. So just to go quickly through the conclusions, what I aimed to do in this talk was to try to argue that one of the key reasons to model infectious diseases is that it allows you to aid in the decision-making process. So you're not going to change the world overnight, but you're definitely going to have the opportunity to contribute to the evidence base for policy making. And I would say that this is a very interesting and rewarding aspect of modeling. So modeling allows us to look beyond the status quo, but we have to be very careful in considering both the design of our models and the presentation of our results. What I've tried to do here is go through the practical stages of model building and show you the complexity of doing this for a disease like TB. And I should have said at the beginning, I'm sorry, but these slides will all be up online on the link that you used yesterday in the lab practical. So, so you can see that flow diagram for yourself there. And also, finally, just to end, so how do you model intervention? So you have to think about what your intervention is going to be very early on in the model building process. So it's not something you can decide at the end, something that you need to build in to the model structure from the beginning. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening, and it's time for coffee, I think. Yeah.
Like looking into any country or any particular region or community, looking into the current vaccine delivery systems, and then potentially integrate the TB vaccine when it's introduced along with the current vaccine delivery systems, rather than trying to undertake another vertical TB vaccine delivery system.
Exactly. That's a great idea. So, so in this, in the project that I talked about here, we were modeling so many countries that we weren't able to break it down into specific different targeting. But yeah, that's something that they're definitely looking into now. There's a lot of operational research going into. So, for example, if a country already has a HPV vaccine program where they're giving it to teenage girls in schools or on boys as well, then yeah, the idea would be that the TB vaccine should hijack onto that campaign. And definitely that if we ever get a HIV vaccine, that also should hijack onto that. So there's definitely a move now to think about, instead of just thinking about an integrated infant vaccine program, we should be thinking about an integrated teenagers or school children vaccine program. But obviously it's influenced a lot by school attendance in different countries. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions at this moment? Okay, let's break for coffee and come back at 12.